So good morning to you all, and before starting my presentation, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference. Well, in my presentation, I shall talk about the role which was played by the European Commission within the broader relationship between the European community and Yugoslavia during the 1970s. Well, needless to say, this is just a case study that is a pretext to investigate one of the four major research questions which have been proposed by the organizers of this colloque. That is the emergence of a new diplomatic practice in the 1970s due to the convergence and mutualization of national diplomacies. It was in this period, in the 1970s, that a new diplomatic milieu was created in Community Brussels. A special network which was characterized by cooperation rather than rivalry between a supranational body, such as the European Commission, and the national diplomacies of the EEC member states. The main argument of my paper is that in the 1970s, the European Commission, despite it possessed direct competence only in the commercial field, became a real diplomatic actor which was deeply involved into the dynamics of the Cold War. With the benefit of hindsight, the cooperation between Commission and national representatives described in my paper anticipates the logic which underpins the present-day European External Action Service, which represents something new in the diplomatic practice in Europe. The European External Action Service is an authentic multinational diplomatic service, yet not only it is composed by diplomats from all EU member states, but it also encompasses officials from the European Commission. Its High Representative, who nowadays is the Italian Federica Mogherini, is a rather peculiar figure. She's at the same time a vice president of the European Commission and the chairman of the Council of Foreign Affairs. In other words, she is at the same time a supranational and intergovernmental figure. And the creation of the European External Action Service, as we know it, could hardly be predicted in the early decades of European integration process. And after all, students of European integration history know very well that the whole integration process is characterized by a continuous struggle between supranational and intergovernmental tendencies. So we may wonder why and how the creation of the European External Action Service was possible. My answer to this question is that the creation of the European External Action Service was not the result of a sudden or unexpected event or a diplomatic negotiation of the last years, but it was rather the result of a process which goes back to the Cold War years. And to understand this point, we can look at the history of the relationship between the European Community and Yugoslavia, a history in which the European Commission and the national diplomacies of the EEC member states were able to integrate one with the other. In my paper, I have analyzed four main episodes which highlight the growing international role of the European Commission and especially its Directorate General for External Relations, the so-called DG1, and the interaction between this body and the national diplomacies of the EEC member states. The first episode concerns the role played by the European Commission during the negotiations for the first EEC-Yugoslav trade agreement, and this negotiation took place between 1968 and 1970. The first agreement between the two parties was closely linked to the Cold War, and especially to the fears of Soviet expansionism in the Balkans in the aftermath of the invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 1968. In fact, more than Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia was considered as a threat to Soviet hegemonism in East Central Europe. The Western powers, including the United States, understood that Yugoslavia should be helped and sustained through a low-profile assistance based on enhanced trade relations. And in this field, the European Commission acted as a broker by linking Yugoslavia's trade requests and the single national positions of the EEC member states. And by virtue of the common commercial policy, which entered into force on January the 1st, 1970, the Commission played the lion's part during the negotiations, which led to the signing of the agreement in March 1970. The Commission was able to resist to French opposition to the inclusion of an agricultural chapter in the negotiating mandate, and was able to represent the EEC as such during the negotiating rounds. And the Commission's role was even recognized by the Yugoslav diplomacy, of course, and even by Josip Broz Tito, who was Yugoslavia's leader since 1945. Tito invited in Belgrade Jean Rey, who was at that time the president of the European Commission, and they discussed the future of EEC-Yugoslav relation from a political perspective. Talks between Tito and Rey took place just 1 month after the signing of the first trade agreement, and it did not only focus on trade, but on the need to increase relations between European blocs, and in this circumstance, Rey stressed the community's readiness to sustain Yugoslavia's independent position between the two blocs. The second episode I have analyzed in my paper concerns the renewal of the 1970 agreement. Once again, the European Commission played a pivotal role in this field. And on the initiative of the newly appointed president, the Italian Franco Maria Malfatti, the Commission contextualized the Yugoslav question in the broader Mediterranean framework. In line with the national diplomacies of the EEC member states, DG1 considered Yugoslavia not only as a trade partner, but as a factor of stability in the Mediterranean. In fact, in the early 1970s, Yugoslavia was characterized by marked political instability due to centrifugal tendencies, especially in Croatia. And this situation was to be contextualized in a Mediterranean arena which looked like a sea of confusion, according to the definition of Effie Pedaliu of the London School of Economics. This was due to the instability in North Africa, instability in the Middle East, of course, and also to the rise of Soviet naval presence in the region. The EEC member states let the Commission play a crucial role within a mixed commission, which had been created by the 1970 agreement, in which the two parties could negotiate discreetly and far from the media spotlights. So the Commission once again was regarded by the EC member states as a useful tool to treat the Yugoslav question discreetly, not to undermine its delicate equilibrium between the two blocs. The third point I raised in my paper concerns the signing of the 1976 EEC-Yugoslav Joint Declaration. And in this circumstance, the emergence of a new diplomatic framework based on integration between supranational elements of the European Commission and national diplomacies became even more evident. This declaration, which was signed on December 2nd, 1976, was meant to demonstrate the community's sustain to Yugoslavia in a context which was characterized by political instability in the southern Mediterranean due to the Cyprus crisis, the incumbent transition processes in Greece, Portugal, and Spain. And as noted by recent historiography, the EEC played an important part in this scenario, also due to the end of Nixon's so-called imperial presidency. And through its soft power, the community favored the political transition from dictatorship to democracy in Greece, Spain, and Portugal, and was therefore able to cope with the so-called Mediterranean challenge. And also Yugoslavia was part of this scenario. due to the question of the country's transition after the death of Tito, who in 1976 was 84 years old and was in precarious health. However, the Yugoslav case was special because it could not be offered any perspective of integration within the community, not to change its non-aligned position. So, how did the EEC manifest its interest in Yugoslavia's stability? So, given the need for a low-profile strategy, the European Commission was deemed to be the best actor to fulfill this role. And the Commission did not accept this role passively. Conversely, officials of DG1 played a pivotal role in proposing the Yugoslav government a joint declaration which represented a clear manifestation of the community's interest in Yugoslavia's independence and stability. The clearest manifestation of the Council's reliance on the Commission is represented by its decision to send Roland de Kergerlet, who was Deputy Director General of DG1, to Belgrade to negotiate the content of such a joint declaration. De Kergerlet arrived in Belgrade on 25th October 1976 as a real Cold War player, because what was at stake was Yugoslavia's future relations with its Western European partners. Therefore, in this circumstance, we can see that national diplomacies recognize that they can be substituted by a supranational actor whose competencies are somehow greater than the arithmetical sum of their national policies. The fourth and last major point, which I highlighted in my paper, is the Commission's role during the long negotiations for the cooperation agreement, which was signed by the two parties in 1980. From an historical viewpoint, this is a very important agreement because it sanctioned the formal separation between the EEC and Yugoslavia, and was the last agreement to be concluded by the two parties until the dissolution of Yugoslavia in 1991. So after the signing of the 1976 joint declaration, the EEC had to cope with two major questions. The first was the preservation of Yugoslavia's independence and non-alignment after the death of Tito. The second was Yugoslavia's place within the Mediterranean basin after the second enlargement. The imperative for the community was that of avoiding leaving Yugoslavia in an isolated position in the Mediterranean basin. So it was once again, thanks to the action of the European Commission, that the European community solved this dilemma. In fact, it was the European Commissioner for External Relations, Wilhelm Afferkamp, who proposed to Yugoslavia a new sui generis approach, which was based on a preferential agreement and the inclusion of Yugoslavia within the EEC's global Mediterranean policy. It was the European Commission which proposed the Yugoslav government this new approach. So we may wonder, why did the Commission acted once again as such an important diplomatic actor? Was it because the EEC member state did not care about Yugoslavia? Well, I don't think this is the answer to this question, and I think we can detect two factors which prompt the nine to favor the Commission initiative. First, their traditional interest in favoring a rapprochement to Belgrade without openly interfering in Yugoslavia's internal affairs. You can imagine that in a climate of declining détente, it was safer to keep the Yugoslav question as far as possible from the East-West confrontation, so as not to jeopardize the European status quo. Second, the nine were aware that at electoral level, meddling into Yugoslavia's internal affairs would not be politically fruitful at the internal level. As the country was ruled by a non-democratic leadership, and there were no perspective of democratic transition, of course, the strengthening of bilateral relations with Belgrade would not be accompanied by the positive political image which was offered by the community's support to the democratization processes in Greece, Spain, and Portugal, for example. Lastly, the Commission's diplomatic role was confirmed after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, which corresponded to the definitive decline of the process of international détente. This event urged the EEC to accelerate the conclusion of the new agreement with Yugoslavia. And it was the Commission which prepared the negotiating mandate, and it was the Director General of DG1, who at that time was Roy Denman, who led the community team during the final negotiating round, which took place in Brussels in February 1980. The cooperation agreement was finally signed in Belgrade on 2 April 1980, just a few weeks after Tito's death. Tito died on 4 May 1980. From the viewpoint of the Nine, this new agreement had a strong political meaning as it represented the means of improving economic relations with Belgrade without compromising Yugoslavia's non-alignment. This goal had been reached mainly through the patient, discreet work of the European Commission, which had emerged as a new diplomatic actor which was able to complement and somehow integrate the action of the national diplomacies. So coming to the conclusion, we know that throughout the 1970s, the EEC developed its international role, and that this development affected the art of diplomacy in Europe. And not only new frameworks of intergovernmental cooperation were created, such as the European Council of the European Political Cooperation, but new diplomatic actors emerged within the community framework. As highlighted in this paper, the European Commission was one of these actors. Only apparently it was a body dealing with economic matters. Under the surface of the water, the Commission was able to convey political messages. In particular, the case of EEC-Yugoslav relations showed the emergence of a European diplomatic framework based on cooperation rather than rivalry between the supranational Commission and the EEC member state. Therefore, I conclude that to understand the nature and the rationale of the present-day European External Action Service, which encapsulates both the supranational and intergovernmental dimensions, it is necessary to look at the diplomatic expertise which was acquired by the Commission during the Cold War years. Je vous remercie beaucoup.